WAKR. And time now to go to film school. Film study professor Joe Fortunato joins us on the show here on 93.5, 1590 WAKR.
You should stop being so good to me, Captain. Don't you ever talk that way to me. Never! Never! What we've got here is failure to communicate. Some men you just can't reach.
Well, that leads you into the movie that Joe Fortunato wants to talk about today. One of my favorites, Cool Hand Luke, and rated as one of the top in Paul Newman's career. Joe, thanks for joining us this morning, and give us the information on Cool Hand Luke.
Well, good morning, Ray. Good morning, everybody. And yeah, today we celebrate the 55th anniversary of Cool Hand Luke, which was released November 1st, 1967. It was directed by Stuart Rosenberg, written by Don Pierce and Frank Pearson, starred, of course, Paul Newman, also George Kennedy, who won a Best Supporting Actor Oscar, as well as Strother Martin as the captain, who delivers the famous line, "What we have here is a failure to communicate," which was voted the number 11 movie quote of all time by the American Film Institute. For those who aren't familiar with the film, it's about a sort of a laid-back Southern man, played by Paul Newman, who's sentenced to 2 years in a rural prison, but refuses to conform. And he battles, of course, a battle of wit and will against the prison establishment. I mentioned the the line, "What we have here, a failure to communicate," was voted very high on the AFI list. It's actually said, and you heard a little clip there, I believe, by Strother Martin, is "what we have here is failure to communicate," without the A. But then later on, Paul Newman repeats the line with "a failure to communicate." So it's one of those lines that can actually be quoted correctly either way, with or without the A. So fun little bit of trivia there. Another famous scene in the film is the hard-boiled egg scene, where Luke is challenged by his inmates to eat 50 eggs in one sitting, and they actually made about 200 hard-boiled eggs for that scene. Paul Newman actually only ate about 8 of those eggs with clever editing. The rest were consumed by cast and crew, which led to a little bit of flatulence the next day on the set. According to George Kennedy, when they filmed the boiled egg scene, director Stuart Rosenberg yelled "cut," and Paul Newman immediately vomited into a garbage can. So there's a little bit of movie magic for you. Stuart Rosenberg, as I said, the director, he actually viewed Luke's character as sort of a stand-in for Jesus Christ. So there's a lot of Christian imagery in the film. Luke is sort of seen as a savior by the other convicts. He gives them hope. After the egg-eating contest that we just mentioned, he's laid out on a table in a posture sort of resembling Jesus' crucifixion. His prison number is 37, which is a reference to the Bible verse Luke 1:37, which is, "For with God nothing shall be impossible." So there's quite a bit of Christian imagery and relevance in the film. One of the interesting things is that they built. It was shot in California, Northern California, but they built a Southern prison camp set for the movie. You know, a dozen buildings were constructed, barracks, mess hall, that kind of thing. But it was so convincing and so real that a county building inspector was passing by and thought it was a real, recently constructed migrant workers complex, and he posted a condemned notice on the building because it wasn't up to code.
Joe Fortunato's with us, film school professor. The movie is Cool Hand Luke. And Joe, when you get into the cast of prisoners, there are some young actors in this movie that really went on to prominence. I think of Dennis Hopper in this movie, Wayne Rogers, Ralph Waite, Joe Don Baker, and of course, George Kennedy, I thought was terrific in the movie.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, George Kennedy won an Oscar, his only Oscar, for Best Supporting Actor. And he said his salary multiplied by 10 the minute he won, and he also said the happiest part was that he didn't have to play villains anymore. So it was a good deal for him. Another famous scene in the movie, I'll talk about some more about casting in a moment, but another famous scene in the movie, of course, is the car wash scene where the actress Joy Harmon plays the sexy woman washing the car, and she's kind of teasing all the convicts, which has sort of become a very famous scene in the movie. And she said that when she filmed, Joy Harmon said that when she filmed the scene, she had no idea it was going to be that suggestive. She said it never really occurred to her until she saw it in the theater. She said I thought I was just washing a car, and she was sort of naive and innocent and not really trying to be sexy. But after seeing it at the premiere, she was a little bit embarrassed. George Kennedy, again, in an interview, said that the scenes were filmed separately. So her washing the car and the convicts mesmerized by her were actually filmed at 2 separate days. So they weren't even together. And in fact, there was an unpaid schoolgirl who was wearing a large overcoat mime the scene, forcing the actors to use their imagination as they ogled her on camera. So they weren't even looking at Joy Harmon when they did that scene.
Okay, more about casting.
Yeah, well, this is sort of casting and producing. Jack Lemmon was actually going to play the part of Luke, but after reading the script, he noticed that Paul Newman really would be better, so he decided to produce it instead. So Jack Lemmon is actually one of the producers of this film. Bette Davis was offered the role of Luke's mother, but she refused the part because it's too small. And Telly Savalas was considered for either Luke or Dragline, but he was in Europe filming The Dirty Dozen, so he couldn't come back and do it.
Very cool. Cool Hand Luke. And I read somewhere, too, Joe, that it was Paul Newman, one of his favorite roles, that he loved that role.
Yeah, and it really is, one of his signature roles. I mean, he has many, but I think it's one that people remember. And for those who aren't aware, and for our Ohio listeners, Paul Newman is from Shaker Heights, Ohio, near Cleveland. He went to Ohio U. He actually got kicked out of Ohio U. His family owned a sporting goods store in the Shaker Heights area, so there's some Ohio roots there with Paul Newman.
All right, there you go. Film School today, the movie Cool Hand Luke with film study professor Joe Fortunato. That will be up at WAKR.net momentarily. Joe, as always, thanks for the time and the visit, my friend. We'll reconnect next Friday.
Thanks, Ray. See you all next week.
There you go. Joe Fortunato, film study professor, joins us Fridays on the Ray Horner Morning Show on WAKR.